Independent member for Goldstein, Zoe Daniel. Lots to discuss today. Zoe Daniel, thanks for your time. I want to start by getting your reaction to that CPI number. Inflation down to 4.1%, lowest in 2 years. Many in your electorate, I'm sure, right around the country, hoping that this means the end of the rate rise cycle.
Absolutely, Kieran. It's really good news. Let's hope it's sustained. And I must say that my first thought when I saw that number went to an interaction that I had with a young girl during the school visit mid last year. She was in year 5 and she came up to me after I'd talked to the class and said, "I've got a question for you." And she was quite intense. And I said, "Oh, what is it?" And she said, "When do you think inflation will end?" And I gave her my estimate, according to economists, that it should come off at some point this year. And I said, "Why are you so concerned about it?" So this child was only 11. And she said, "Mum and Dad are really stressed and we're worried that we might lose our
Yeah.
house." And that really struck a chord with me as someone whose family went through 18% interest rates, and we had to sell our house back in the day as a result of that. So for those families, I really hope that this is a sustained drop.
Indeed, and and that trajectory looks good. Let's talk about the other side of this now and discussion about cost of living relief, the stage 3 tax changes. Have you landed on a position yourself as to which way you will vote when it comes to Parliament?
Look, I'm still working through it, and there are some variables there because, of course, the government will negotiate with potentially the Greens, the opposition's still having a look at its position. So it'll be a case of looking at the actual legislation at the time. I'm also surveying my electorate, and I would say that the results are interesting. It's an imperfect science, Kieran, but in 48 hours, we had about 2,500 responses. About a quarter of those were from people with incomes over 180,000, so who will be negatively affected by this change. But despite that, around 3/4 of respondents supported more support for middle and low income earners and were in support of the government's shift. So if that's a leading indicator of how I will represent my electorate, you can take what you will from that. And also, Treasury figures show that around 70% of my electorate, even in one of the wealthiest electorates in Australia, will stand to gain from this policy change. So they're the kinds of things that I'm considering right now.
So that is interesting, with a fair chunk of your comparatively, we have to say, pretty wealthy electorate by national standards, but a big chunk of that electorate would earn above the 180 or let's say $150,000 mark, where people will be worse off as opposed to better off under the original stage 3. They'll still get tax cuts, but comparatively worse off. But many of those still think it should be modified.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not living in la la land on this. There will be some people in my electorate who are really unhappy about this decision. And part of that goes to the broken promise aspect. I think there are two distinct things. One is they were told something was going to happen and now it's changed. And people
Yeah.
don't like the government changing promises. So that's one issue. The second thing, though, which is really what I'm considering, because the government's broken promise is its problem, is what's the substantive impact of the policy shift. And even in my electorate, as you say, I'm not only comparatively wealthy, highly wealthy compared to the rest of the country. Less than 10% of the electorate earns over the threshold whereby they will be negatively affected. So the vast majority of people in my electorate, many of whom are women who work in feminised industries, for example, stand to gain. So they're the sorts of considerations that I have to factor in ahead of making a decision in the chamber on how to vote on legislation.
It was reported that you were always supportive of a review of stage 3. Is that a fair way to characterise your assessment of the tax situation, and that you always had some doubts there?
So I've never taken a defined position on stage 3. What I've said previously, because I've surveyed the electorate on this before, is that the results from the surveys indicate that people were willing to tolerate a review. And by a review, I mean the government saying, should we still do this? are these policy settings still right? So I surveyed the electorate, I think it was in April last year. At that time, 75% of those who responded said, we're up for a review. I've just done a similar survey again, roughly the same numbers, saying, yes, we're happy with this policy
Yeah.
change, and also we think low and middle income earners should get a bigger slice. And also, I've had people ringing and emailing me saying that they stand to benefit from the previous settings, so the larger tax cut, because they're in the higher income band. And while they would like that money and it would be helpful for their mortgage payments and such, they're not struggling to put food on the table. So they are able to see a more nuanced perspective around the level of need in the community around cost of living issues.
Member for Goldstein, Zoe Daniel, always appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kieran.